When I was younger, I always imagined that the golden years of life would be filled with peace, laughter, and shared moments with the one I loved. But now, at 78, I find myself waking up every morning with a knot in my stomach, not from the weight of the years, but from the constant strain of compromise. I never thought it would be like this. Take Walter and Linda, for example. Walter is a 78-year-old man who spent his entire adult life adjusting to Linda's needs. Their relationship was once filled with love, but now, those small adjustments have become something far heavier, like a slow, silent poison that's slowly draining his energy. At one time, they made all their decisions together: where to go, what to eat, how to spend their free time. But now, every little thing is a battle. A quiet breakfast in peace? Impossible, because Linda insists on having the television blaring at full volume, even at 7 a.m. These might seem like trivial matters to some, but for Walter, it's an exhausting routine. What does it really mean to have a partner in old age? Is it a comfort, or is it more of a burden? And is there a way, as Walter sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the horizon, he couldn't help but think about all the years he and Linda had spent together. Their love had been built on shared dreams and countless compromises. But now, in the quiet of the morning, Walter realized that those compromises had started to take a toll. The truth is, aging isn't always the peaceful, serene journey we expect. In fact, for many people, it can feel more like a slow unraveling of everything they once knew physically, emotionally, and mentally. For Walter, it was becoming clear that the constant adjustments he had made over the years weren't just draining his energy, they were eroding his sense of self. Linda, despite her good intentions, couldn't understand Walter's need for quiet solitude. She still wanted the same closeness, the same connection, even though the years had changed the way they both saw the world. To her, their togetherness meant sharing everything, even the smallest of details: what to watch, when to speak, how to spend their time. But for Walter, the endless compromises were no longer worth it. What he needed most in his later years was peace, a chance to reconnect with himself without the constant need to negotiate every little thing. It wasn't that Walter didn't love Linda. He did. But the reality of their relationship had begun to feel more like an obligation than a partnership. As he thought back over the years, he remembered a time when they had made decisions together with joy and laughter. But now, those moments had become rare. The simple act of choosing what to have for dinner had turned into another negotiation. Where they would go for a walk, what to do on the weekends. Even the time they woke up, it all felt like another small battle. Walter had to fight just to feel at peace. Walter began to wonder, was this really the way he wanted to spend his final years? Constantly adjusting, constantly compromising, giving up his own happiness for the sake of someone else's comfort? The truth was, as we age, we start to realize that time is precious, and the years we have left should be about doing what truly brings us joy, not simply keeping the peace. He started to question whether he could continue living this way. Was there another option? Could he still have companionship without feeling trapped by it? Could he regain the independence he had long lost without losing the love and connection he once cherished? Walter didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. It was time to face the truth about his own needs and about the reality of growing older. For many people like Walter, the truth is that relationships in old age can become more complicated than they once were. What started as a partnership built on love can slowly become a series of compromises that drain your energy, strip away your independence, and leave you feeling emotionally exhausted. As we grow older, We need to be brave enough to acknowledge these challenges and make choices that serve our well being. And for Walter, that meant making a difficult decision. It wasn't about rejecting Linda or abandoning their shared history. It was about reclaiming his peace of mind, his independence, and his happiness. Because in the end, the truth about old age is simple. It's not about what you give to others, it's about what you give to yourself. Walter sat quietly, his mind racing, as he thought about the years he had spent with Linda. He loved her dearly, but the weight of their relationship had begun to feel heavier than ever. He could feel the tension in his chest, as the familiar routine of compromise and sacrifice seemed to squeeze the life out of him. What had once felt like a partnership, built on mutual respect and shared dreams, now felt like an endless list of adjustments that only drained his energy. As the days passed, Walter's thoughts turned to the deeper struggles of aging. In the quiet solitude of his morning walks, he began to understand something about the complexities of growing older. He realized that it wasn't just about his own exhaustion, it was about the exhaustion that came with growing older alongside someone else, especially when the world around you changes so quickly. There were times when Walter thought back to the earlier days of their marriage, when they could still explore the world together, when their bond was built on shared joy and adventure. But now, the simple act of choosing where to spend the afternoon felt like a monumental task. Linda, who had once been his partner in every sense, seemed to have developed a different rhythm of life, one that didn't quite match Walter's desire for peace and quiet. Walter wasn't angry at Linda. He understood. She too was aging, and with it came her own fears, needs, and desires. She had always been the life of the party, the one who wanted constant connection and engagement. But Walter had changed. He longed for the stillness of his own thoughts, the opportunity to simply be without the pressure of constant adjustment. He understood that Linda's desire for closeness wasn't out of malice. It was born of the same vulnerability that he felt. Both of them were navigating the complexities of aging, and neither of them had the answers. What became clear to Walter was that the emotional burden of constant compromise wasn't just a matter of his own needs. It was a shared struggle that many older couples face. The older you get, the more you realize that the compromises you once made for the sake of love and connection can start to feel like chains, and yet, walking away from them isn't an easy choice. Walter understood this better than anyone. The bond of years, the shared memories, the companionship, those weren't things you could easily throw away. But neither could he ignore the growing realization that his own happiness and sense of peace were slipping away. In the end, Walter realized that the most profound challenge in old age wasn't necessarily the physical changes, but the emotional adjustments that came with living a lifetime alongside another person. As you grow older, you become more aware of your own limits, your own needs. The truth was, it wasn't about rejecting Linda. It was about acknowledging the unspoken truth that sometimes, for both partners, finding peace meant acknowledging the personal challenges of living together in the twilight years. Walter wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he did know one thing: understanding these struggles and accepting them was the first step toward truly finding peace. Walter sat in his favorite armchair by the window, gazing out at the morning sky, his mind weighed down by the thoughts that had been swirling for months. The stillness of the room around him seemed to echo the silence that had begun to fill his life. He had been carrying the burden of compromise for so long, silently bearing the weight of expectations that weren't his own. As he looked out at the world, it felt as though the answer he had been searching for was right there, hidden in the simplicity of the horizon. But how could he possibly make the change? How could he free himself from the pressures of a relationship that had shaped his entire adult life? It wasn't that Walter didn't love Linda. He still cared for her deeply. The years they had spent together were filled with moments of laughter, love, and shared dreams. But somewhere along the way, they had drifted. The compromises that once felt like acts of love had slowly turned into obligations, and Walter could feel his spirit becoming more and more drained. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed to take back his life. For the first time in years, Walter allowed himself to ask a question he had never dared to. What would it be like to truly live for himself? To make decisions based solely on his desires and needs, without worrying about constantly adjusting to someone else's preferences? He had always prided himself on being a caring and considerate partner, but now he wondered if being so selfless had caused him to lose sight of who he truly was. His mornings, once filled with quiet reflection and solitude, had become crowded with the noise of compromise. His life, which should have been defined by peace, had instead been shaped by the needs of another. As the days went by, Walter began to take small steps. He started with little things, deciding what he wanted for breakfast without asking Linda for her opinion, choosing a book to read without feeling the need to consider whether Linda would enjoy it too. It wasn't about being cruel or dismissive of her needs, but rather about finding space for his own. Slowly but surely, he started to feel the freedom he had been missing. It wasn't just about independence, it was about reclaiming the autonomy he had lost over the years. One afternoon, as Walter sat in his garden, the realization hit him with quiet force. I am not just a husband, a caretaker, a partner. I am Walter, and it's time I started living for me. The thought was liberating. It didn't mean abandoning Linda. It meant freeing himself from the suffocating expectations that had held him captive for so long. He began to see that true love wasn't about constant compromise. It was about respecting each other's need for space, peace, and individuality. That evening, when Linda came home, Walter decided to have a conversation. It wasn't an easy one, but it was necessary. He spoke openly about the toll that years of constant compromise had taken on him. He explained how he needed more room to breathe, to rediscover himself, and to live without the pressure of always putting someone else's needs before his own. Linda listened, her eyes filled with understanding. And though the conversation was difficult, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where both of them would learn to live not only as partners, but as individuals too. For Walter, that moment was the first true step toward freedom. It wasn't about rejecting love or abandoning his responsibilities. It was about finding a way to embrace his own life again, to live with intention, and to allow the possibility of true peace in his later years. Walter leaned back in his chair, staring at the stack of medical bills on the table. He had tried to ignore them for weeks, but now they felt like an insurmountable weight on his chest. Linda's health had been slowly declining for the past few years, and as much as he wanted to be there for her, the toll it was taking on him was becoming undeniable. The emotional exhaustion of constant caregiving had worn him thin, and the financial strain was starting to show. The money he had carefully saved over the years was now slipping away, spent on hospital visits, medications, and home care services. The stress was mounting in every corner of his life. It wasn't just the money, it was the emotional burden of watching someone you love suffer, knowing that no matter how much you give, it never feels like enough. Walter had always been the type to put others first, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing pieces of himself in the process. Each day he found himself walking a tightrope, balancing Linda's needs with his own, and trying to hold onto a sense of self while everything around him seemed to be crumbling. The guilt of wanting more freedom, of needing time for himself, gnawed at him constantly. He loved Linda, but the reality of caregiving, its constant emotional and physical demands, was suffocating. It was around this time that Walter began to realize something he had never truly acknowledged before. Relationships in old age could be a double-edged sword. On one hand, they provided companionship and shared memories, but on the other, they came with burdens that weren't always visible to the outside world. The financial strain alone was overwhelming. As Walter sat at the kitchen table, going over the numbers, he realized that the dreams he had for his later years traveling, pursuing hobbies, spending time with friends, were slipping further out of reach. He couldn't remember the last time he had done something purely for himself. His finances, once stable, were now tied to the expenses of Linda's care. The weight of it all began to feel like too much to bear. Then there was the toll on his health. Walter had always been a healthy man, but the stress and lack of sleep were starting to take their toll. He hadn't been to the doctor in months. His routine had become a blur of helping Linda, managing bills, and trying to keep up with his own responsibilities. He had forgotten what it felt like to take a long walk by himself or spend a quiet evening reading a book. He had forgotten what it felt like to take care of his own well-being. The constant state of worry, coupled with the physical demands of caregiving, left him feeling drained and helpless. One evening, after another long day of caring for Linda, Walter found himself sitting alone in his living room, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He thought about the years they had spent together, the good times, the bad, and the compromises they had both made. But now, looking at the reality before him, he couldn't help but wonder if the relationship was truly serving them both. He had always assumed that growing old together meant peace and happiness, but now he wasn't so sure. It wasn't just about him anymore. Walter knew that Linda was feeling the weight of the situation too. She hated seeing him struggle, hated that he had to sacrifice so much of his own happiness for her. But the truth was, they were both stuck in a cycle. The emotional exhaustion, the financial strain, and the toll on their health were slowly eroding the joy they had once shared. Walter realized that they had both been so focused on maintaining the relationship, on making things work, that they had forgotten to prioritize their own well-being. The harsh truth began to settle in. Relationships in old age, especially those marked by illness and caregiving, weren't always the source of peace and comfort they were imagined to be. Instead, they could become a slow drain physically, emotionally, and financially. Walter knew that he needed to make a choice, a difficult one, but he also knew that sometimes stepping back from a relationship, or at least changing the dynamic, could be the key to finding the peace and happiness they both needed. Walter sat on the porch, the cool evening breeze gently rustling the leaves of the trees. The house felt quieter now, without Linda's presence. For years, he had lived in a constant state of motion, caring for her, managing appointments, and balancing the demands of their daily life. But now, the silence was something new. It wasn't filled with loneliness. Instead, it felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in a long while, Walter realized just how much he had been suffocating in the responsibilities of caregiving, the weight of emotional exhaustion, and the pressure of always putting someone else's needs first. Living alone, he discovered, brought a sense of freedom he had forgotten existed. No longer was he bound by the endless list of tasks that had filled his days. There was no longer the constant tension of needing to be in two places at once, taking care of Linda, managing finances, and juggling his own well-being. Now, he could take the time to breathe, to think, and to focus on himself in a way that had seemed impossible for so many years. The first few weeks alone were strange, but gradually, Walter began to appreciate the quiet moments. He could spend his mornings however he wished, whether it was reading the paper, going for a walk, or simply enjoying a cup of coffee, without the rush of caregiving looming over him. There was no longer the guilt of neglecting his own needs. What struck him most was the sense of autonomy he felt. For so long, his life had been intertwined with Linda's, and while the love they shared had been beautiful, it had also come with a heavy cost. Now, living alone, Walter realized that he had regained control of his time, his space, and his choices. He could travel, visit friends, or simply enjoy the peace of being by himself. The financial strain had lifted, as he was no longer responsible for medical bills and constant care. Walter's story became one of liberation. He had thought that losing Linda meant losing part of himself, but instead, it turned out to be the beginning of a new chapter. The loss of a spouse, while painful, had allowed him to rediscover the joys of living independently. He found freedom in making decisions solely for himself, in taking up new hobbies he had once forgotten, and in enjoying his own company without the pressures of a relationship weighing him down. For the first time in years, Walter felt like he could breathe again. He had found something precious in the solitude: freedom, peace, and a chance to reconnect with his own desires and dreams. He had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the ability to live on your own terms, free from the burdens of constant compromise. As the months passed, Walter couldn't help but reflect on the reality of his marriage with Linda. Their love had once been effortless, filled with laughter and shared dreams. But as the years wore on, it had become a constant cycle of caregiving, worry, and emotional exhaustion. He had never imagined that their final years together would be so filled with uncertainty. The long, drawn-out process of Linda's illness had slowly drained them both. Walter recalled the countless doctor visits, the endless medication schedules, and the never-ending concerns about her health. He had taken on the role of caretaker without question, driven by love, but the toll it took on him was undeniable. There were days when he felt like he could barely keep his eyes open, his mind constantly racing with worries about whether he had done enough for Linda or if he was making the right choices. The weight of it all was a constant presence in their home. More than just the physical exhaustion, there was the emotional burden that had slowly worn him down. The constant need to reassure Linda, to calm her fears, to make decisions that no one ever expects to make for a loved one. It was overwhelming. Walter had spent so many years adjusting to Linda's needs that he had forgotten what it felt like to put himself first. His own desires, his own well-being, had taken a back seat. But the hardest part, perhaps, was the loss of their connection. As Linda's health deteriorated, their relationship changed. They were no longer the partners who could laugh together over dinner or dream of future vacations. Their conversations had become centered around her illness, and their time together was spent managing her care rather than cherishing each other's company. Walter found himself grieving not just for Linda's declining health, but for the partnership they had once shared. It felt like he had lost her long before her passing. Facing the truth of their situation was painful, but it was necessary. It was important for Walter to acknowledge that their final years together had not been the peaceful, idyllic retirement he had imagined. Instead, they had been filled with difficult choices, emotional turmoil, and the reality of what it truly meant to care for someone in their later years. Walter knew now that these challenges were not unique to him, nor were they something to be ashamed of. Aging in a relationship was hard emotionally, mentally, and physically. The truth was, No one talked about the emotional exhaustion, the resentment, or the toll that caregiving took. It was a silent burden that many carried, and Walter understood that. It was in these difficult, raw moments that Walter realized how important it was to speak honestly about aging in relationships, to shed the idealized notion that growing old together would always be a smooth and happy journey. The reality was much more complex, and acknowledging that complexity was the first step toward healing and finding peace in his own journey. As Walter sat quietly in his favorite chair, the weight of his reflections on the years past seemed to hang in the air around him. The house was still, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself not focusing on the needs of another person, but on his own. Linda was gone, and though he missed her deeply, he was beginning to understand the importance of caring for himself, something he had neglected for far too long. In the months following her passing, Walter had come to a realization that had slowly changed the way he approached life in his later years. He had always been a selfless partner, pouring all of his energy into making Linda comfortable, ensuring her needs were met, and sacrificing his own happiness in the process. But now, in this quiet space of solitude, Walter saw that he had neglected his own well-being in the name of love and duty. He had let the demands of a relationship consume him, and it had taken a toll on his health physically, mentally, and emotionally. As he reflected on this, Walter realized that he didn't want to fall into the same patterns again. He wanted to take control of his life, to prioritize his own health and happiness, and to remember that it was okay to put himself first. He thought about the many friends he had seen in similar situations, couples who had lived their entire lives in constant compromise, never really stopping to ask themselves what they truly needed. He saw now that this could be a dangerous path to follow, one that left people feeling empty, exhausted, and disconnected from themselves. Walter knew that it was time to focus on his own well-being, time to indulge in the hobbies he once loved, to spend time with friends, and to enjoy his freedom without the pressure of caring for another. The message he had learned was clear. It wasn't selfish to prioritize your own needs as you age. In fact, it was necessary. Taking care of your own health, finding joy in your own company, and embracing your independence could provide a sense of renewal and empowerment. Walter's journey had taught him that living a fulfilling life in your later years wasn't about clinging to an idealized vision of partnership. It was about finding balance, freedom, and self-care. He had learned that, sometimes, the most loving thing you could do for yourself and others was to take a step back, honor your own needs, and embrace the freedom that came with living independently. After all, happiness didn't have to be defined by being with someone else. It could be found in the peace and contentment of being at ease with oneself. With a gentle smile, Walter stood up from his chair, feeling lighter than he had in years. He knew that from here on out, he would focus on what truly mattered: his own health, happiness, and independence. And in doing so, he felt a sense of relief, knowing that he was on the right path, ready to embrace whatever the future held. As Walter looked out the window, watching the sunlight spill over the garden, his mind wandered back to the days when life felt more complex. He thought about the years spent with Linda, the sacrifices, the compromises, and the moments of joy they shared. But now, in the silence of his home, he began to ask himself questions he had never dared to consider before. Am I living for my own happiness, or have I spent my life making decisions for others? Am I maintaining relationships because it's what I know, or am I afraid of being alone? These were questions that hadn't even crossed his mind when he was younger. Back then, it was all about building a life together, working as a team, and honoring commitments. But now, alone with his thoughts, he realized how easy it had been to lose himself in the process, to put his own needs aside in favor of keeping others content. And as the years had passed, he had unknowingly become accustomed to a rhythm of life that didn't always align with his true desires. Walter didn't have the answers right away, but the questions were starting to spark something inside him, a sense of curiosity about himself that had been buried under years of routines and responsibilities. He began to wonder if the choices he had made were truly his own, or if they had been influenced by a fear of change, a fear of being alone. He reflected on the past few months, the peace he felt living on his own, and the freedom to make decisions that were about his own happiness. This was the moment Walter understood that the path ahead wasn't about finding someone else to share his life with, but rather about finding contentment within himself. The more he reflected, the more he realized that this was a journey he needed to take on his own terms. Could it be that happiness doesn't have to come from someone else, but from within? He wasn't sure, but the idea was liberating. As Walter sat back in his chair, he realized that these questions weren't just for him. They were for everyone who found themselves at a crossroads, wondering if they were living authentically or simply following a path of convenience. He wanted to share this realization with others, to encourage them to reflect on their own lives and ask themselves, am I living for my own happiness or for someone else's? Am I staying in this relationship because it brings me joy or because I fear being alone? As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the room, Walter took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. His eyes, filled with a mixture of reflection and hope, slowly softened as he spoke, addressing the audience with a sincerity that could be felt through the screen. I know this journey of self-reflection is never easy, Walter said, his voice gentle but steady. But it's one that can lead to freedom, to understanding what truly makes us happy, and what it means to live on our own terms. So, if you're feeling the weight of the same questions, or maybe you've already been down this road, I want you to share your thoughts with me. Let's have this conversation together. He paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle in. If this story resonates with you, if you find yourself asking those tough questions about your own life, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe to Senior Moments Matt. This is a space where we can explore these real, raw moments of life together. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below, whether it's a question, your own experiences, or just something on your heart. We're all in this journey together, and your voice matters. Walter smiled, his face reflecting the peace he had found in embracing the journey of self-discovery. Remember, life is about making choices that bring you peace. Let's support each other in finding that peace, no matter what stage of life we're in. I look forward to hearing from you, and I'll see you in the next video.